Hello. I'll talk about the environmental impact of disasters. The case of a mine tailings dam that collapsed in Brazil in November 2015. I'm Luis Sanchez. I teach at the University of São Paulo, and I'm speaking on behalf of my co-author, Stephen Edwards, from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and my colleagues at the Rio Doce Panel, an independent advisory body that has been established to advise on the restoration of the affected areas. An iron ore mine located in a place known as Mariana in Brazil, in the Doce River, collapsed on the 5th of November of 2015, spreading mine tailings over a long stretch of the Rio Doce, up to its mouth in the Atlantic Ocean. So a large area was affected, and it's estimated that about 39 million cubic meters of tailings were spread. Unfortunately, 19 people died, and many more had their livelihoods disrupted as the mud wave crossed the river and reached the ocean. The panel is one of the similar panels established by IUCN to advise on different environmental issues. It's defined as an independent scientific and technical advisory panel. It's composed of 7 members, and the aim is to provide science-based advice specifically to one institution that has been created to deal with the effects of the disaster, called Fundão Renova, and other stakeholders about restoration of ecosystems and livelihoods in the area affected by the disaster. The panel works by reviewing documents, meeting people, making site visits, and produce documents, 2 different kinds of documents, containing recommendations for those stakeholders. The standpoint of the panel is to look at the problem at using a landscape approach, considering a long-term perspective, and always providing science-based advice. That's a map, it's a short map of the Rio Doce watershed, showing parts of the remaining natural vegetation, which is very much restricted to protected areas. The total area of the watershed is about 86,000 square kilometers. There are 2 kinds of documents containing recommendations provided by this group, by the panel. One of them is called thematic reports. They are in-depth reviews of one particular issue pertaining to the disaster and the restoration. And the other one is called issue paper. Deals with detailed topic or develops one of the recommendations provided in one of those thematic reports. All of them are available in the internet. I will show you the website at the end of the presentation. We look at the problem using a pressure impact state response perspective. So we understand that the dam failure was responsible for a series of biophysical and social or socio-economic impacts, but the affected environment was also under pressure from other activities made in the past or currently undertook at the time the dam failed. So the environment and the communities were affected on several ways, and both the companies involved in the mining process and government authorities at several levels were organized to provide a response. We organized those responses in 3 major types. We call remediation, looking at mostly short-term remediation of damage, restoration, restoring affected ecosystem and livelihoods of affected communities, and compensation for those damage or impacts that cannot be adequately remediated or restored. Together, they make up what we call mitigation programs. And we look at those programs under the perspective that they should, or their purpose is to deliver sustainable and resilient mitigation. developing mitigation measures that are respectful of the rights of the people and take into account long-term threats that could threat the very purpose or the objective of each of the restoration programs, such as climate change. We also look especially at the outcomes of those programs as compared with what we could call a look at the process of restoration. We, of course, need to take into account the process that has been set up, including the very important aspect of governance, but we're particularly concerned with the outcomes of those programs. In our very first report, so we started working in 2017, and the first report was published in September 2018, contains a series of recommendations. One of them is that the stakeholders, in particular this entity I called Fundão Renova, should prepare a comprehensive assessment of the impact of the dam failure. Basically, when the disaster took place, government agencies, several agencies from several levels of government, organized themselves to tell the company responsible for the disaster, what to do and what would be their main tasks in the short and the long term. But that was made on the basis of what was known at that time, a few months after the disaster. This recommendation or this report contains other recommendations, and I will develop particularly on this first one, which was further developed later in a series of practical advice on how to develop that comprehensive assessment. Upon request of Fundão Renova, we prepared a framework for surveying and having a register of all impacts that could be reasonably linked to the disaster. So our advice is essentially on how best to collect, to systematize, and to analyze existing data and information to perform a retrospective impact assessment that could be used in support of mitigation, of design and mitigation, and of evaluating the results, the outcome of mitigation programs. We propose that they work by listing the impacts and their main characteristics, following a matrix to synthesize information. There are several columns in that matrix I will briefly explain. We start using the central concept of cumulative effects assessment, which is the notion of valued component. So for each component, we advise that the impact on each component be described, that the pathway that led to that impact be surveyed, and that the impacts be characterized in terms of affected area, the temporal scale, magnitude, that they assign an indicator of incertitude about magnitude, and that they consider cumulative impacts by asking two basic questions. First one is to what extent or whether or not are there persistent effects of present and past actions that affect that valued component, and which are those past or current actions that affect those components. We then ask questions about mitigation. As I had told you, a series of mitigation programs had been devised from the very beginning. So we need to ask if mitigation is being, if there is mitigation for that particular impact, one by one, which kind of mitigation, which would be or should be the indicator of success, what are the main threats to the success of mitigation or its effectiveness, what is the level of confidence that we could have on that particular mitigation measure, and also if mitigation has any adverse social or environmental impacts. For example, compensation programs, monetary compensation programs, may have an adverse effects on the sustainability of livelihoods of local communities, just to mention one example. I mentioned an example of how this table could be filled in. So one relative simple example, because in some case the situation could be very complex in terms of identifying the impacts and linking them to the dam failure. So for example, for riverine ecosystems, if you take one part of that component, which are the river margins and banks, one impact could be described as an alteration in the profile because tailings were deposited over the river banks and over the bottom of the river. So the characteristics have been changed in terms of geomorphological characteristics of forms. The pathway is basically through erosion and deposition of sediments in the margins and in the bottom. We describe which is the affected area. These are the names of the creeks most close to the site of the former dam. The expected temporal scale or the duration of that impact, an indicator of magnitude, in this case it has not been developed so far to our knowledge, and how well do we know or how well can we do statements about the magnitude of that impact. For that purpose, we propose a three-scale qualitative scale to describe the uncertainty that they could have about magnitude of each impact. Continuing in that matrix, in that case, certainly there are persistent effects of past actions such as deforestation for expansion of agriculture, urban expansion, iron mining in recent years, in the 20th century, but also historical gold mining in the 18th and 19th centuries. Mitigation that has been implemented in this case are several measures to stabilize margins and planting seedlings in order to stabilize the margin. This is a view of one of the creeks affected by the tailings. So a wave of mud passed through this place and deposited over the banks. What we can see now are grasses essentially that have been planted over the tailings. This is a type of remediation we could call remediation. There is not yet a clear indicator of success. Threats to effectiveness include invasion by cattle, invasion by exotic grasses that are used to feed the cattle. The level of confidence we have in the effectiveness, we also propose a qualitative scale with these exact descriptors. And any adverse environmental and social aspects or impacts resulting from mitigation, in this case, is the loss of pasture land, because after the grasses, native trees should be or have been planted over the river banks. That means a reduction in the area available for pasture for local landowners. And we also say that, and I'll tell you why soon, it's necessary when applying this to have a clear reference about the source that support the conclusions that are summarized in this table. So the purpose of all this is to have a survey of what are or were in the past the impacts of the dam failure, but also to understand the main threats to the effectiveness of mitigation, to know if mitigation could be the cause of any adverse social or environmental impacts, and to determine if any additional mitigation would be necessary in order for the full activities of restoration to be considered sustainable and resilient. In terms of source of data and information, there are literally hundreds of studies that have been developed in the 5 years since the disaster took place. A recent survey by Renova Foundation personnel found that at least 338 such reports, commissioned or prepared by themselves, could be useful or had some information about the impacts. In addition, there are documents of the government bodies. They are called Interfederative Committee, the coalition of those agencies. Also documents, critical documents prepared by third parties, in particular related to court lawsuits, and also a number of peer-reviewed papers published in the literature that have been published since a few months after the disaster. So there are several sources of information, but each one, of course, that's natural, by having their own objectives, research methods, and study areas, among others, have particular pieces of information that should be put together in order for anyone to have a comprehensive picture of the impacts of that dam failure. In terms of how our advice has been received, it took some time for the Renova to organize internally in order to reply if they would be accepted and would be willing to implement the advice or adapting that advice for that particular purpose. And they created internally a new division that they called Impact Curatorship that has its own staff and external consultants to carry on this duty. Some of the challenges, one of them I already mentioned, another one is poor knowledge of the baseline prior to the disaster. Of course, that it's different according to the type of component in consideration for water, soil, land cover, and so on. But also the time lag since the dam failure. So in 5 years, many natural processes took place in the areas affected by the failure and the position of the tailings. But yet there are many unknowns, there are many hypotheses that have not been properly and adequately tested. Also another challenge, developing on what I had said just recently, is that there will be a huge task in matching information from different sources. And it's conceivable, it's likely, that there will be contradictory information that needs to be sorted out and properly understood in order to have this comprehensive picture of the impacts of the disaster. The final purpose, we hope that this exercise could help to draw lessons that could be useful for addressing environmental and social impacts in the context of disasters. We have our website, it's iucn.org/Rio Doce Panel, and you are very much welcome to ask questions here or to visit our website. Thank you for your attention.